Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching a brand new edition of India's World with me, Rausan Pereira. With a month and a half to go before he demits office, outgoing Maldives President Abdullah Yameen is trying every trick in the book to discredit the recent elections and is trying to stay in power. Last week, even as former President Mohamed Nasheed tweeted that he would land in Malé on November 1st, regardless of the judicial strictures against him, Yameen's party, PPM, passed a resolution in a small group that they would not accept Ibrahim Solih as the new president of Maldives. Meanwhile, reports surfaced that Yameen was given a large sum of money just before the elections. Another development was that China has said it wants to deepen mutually beneficial cooperation with the Maldives. President Xi Jinping said in a congratulatory message to the newly elected Maldivian president. President-elect of the Maldives also scored another victory by securing a majority in parliament after the election commission restored 12 lawmakers who were earlier deemed to have lost their seats. Ibrahim Mohamed Solih won last month's presidential election and is to be sworn in next month. On this edition of India's World, we will analyze the developments in the Maldives. Joining me on the program today are Pinak Ranjan Chakravarty, former secretary, MEA and distinguished fellow, Observer Research Foundation. Professor Swaran, Singh, School of International Studies, JNU, and Alok Bansal, Director, India Foundation. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of India's World. Professor, I'd like to begin the program with you. You know, there were apprehensions when the election results were declared, when Solih was, named as the next president of the Maldives, whether there would be a smooth transition from the previous government to the next government. Initially, of course, those fears were wiped out when a press conference was addressed by Yameen and he said that, he conceded defeat. But that suddenly doesn't seem to be the case anymore.
I think if you look at last 2 months, initially President Nasheed was supposed to contest elections, then he of course declined. And then Ibrahim Solih was selected as a candidate. The margin of victory is so substantive that the mandate from the people is absolutely clear. So there will be some murmurs, I suppose, within the party that has been in power, at least some sections of that party. But President himself has not taken any legal initiative in contesting the verdict. And second, equally important, though India has been relatively lukewarm, perhaps in that context, both United States and European Union have been very active. In fact, they have been mentioning possibilities of slapping sanctions in case there is any malpractice found in elections. So definitely, I think that the anticipation 2 months back was that President Yameen is holding elections to come back to power and reinforces his acceptability at home. But the very decisive nature of the verdict that has come out, despite these irritations, I think is going to ultimately deliver and we will see a smooth transition. And obviously India sees this as a kind of a new opportunity, and I assume India would also become increasingly proactive in ensuring that the transition is smooth. I believe transition is going to be on time and smooth, and there may be little objections here and there, but the decisive nature of mandate, I think, is the strongest indicator here.
Alok Bansal, would you agree with that? The decisive nature of the mandate is what's keeping Yameen at bay really at this point in time and does not have too many cards to play.
No, I don't think so. I think till the time Solih actually comes to power on 17th November, anything and everything is possible. In fact, even this news that Solih has consolidated his position in the parliament is also, I think, a little delayed, because subsequently what the Supreme Court of Maldives has said is that the Selection Commission does not have the right to reinstate those 12 MPs and says it's still hearing the petitions. Now, thereby ensuring that parliamentary majority is still with Yameen. And the way the Supreme Court has passed the strictures, that shows that with the 2 judges of the Supreme Court who are already imprisoned, the current Supreme Court is also favorably disposed towards Yameen. So, although initially he gave a press conference and seemed resigned to the fate that yes, he's lost the elections, but the transition Director General of Transition has also been appointed. But you never know, because this man is capable of blatantly rigging a decision. Like when Supreme Court gave a decision against him, when these 12 lawmakers were previously reinstated, He imposed an emergency, jailed 2 of the Supreme Court judges, thereby regaining a majority in the Supreme Court, and then got that judgment quashed. So this chap is capable of anything. Now it is important that the international community must maintain the pressure so that this chap delivers on what he has promised.
You know, Ambassador, the fact that Xi Jinping has congratulated Solih and said that he wants to deepen cooperation with him and the new government, does that say anything really?
Well, it simply says that China is hedging and China is willing to do business with the new government. That's what I think they are trying to send a message, that we are not married to one president.
Have they resorted to the fact that Yamin is out?
Well, I think, as I said, they also probably don't know whether Solih is going to take over and whether some more hurdles are going to be placed in. But they have reached out to the new, obviously, president-elect, and clearly because they feel that perhaps there is a good chance that Solih will probably take over on the 17th, despite the hiccups that might come. Because so far, I also don't get the feeling, though I want to, put in a caveat saying that you never know till it happens, that it might go through. The election results would be respected. I think the whole world is watching. The international community is watching. And I don't think President Yamin can do something so drastic as to subvert this mandate of the people, really. Because if it were a smaller margin, maybe he would be more sort of inclined to do some kind of skullduggery to subvert the thing. But the mandate is so sort of, what shall I say, so overwhelming. And people were clearly tired of this man's, corruption and all kinds of things. There are hundreds of allegations that have.
So, what were the factors that influenced the polls, do you think? I mean, was China a big factor as well? People of Maldives fed up with really the scheme of things as far as Beijing is concerned?
I wouldn't say that, because I think the infrastructure built by China has been welcomed by the people. But in the process, the kind of briberies, the kind of sale of islands in the tourism, sector, and people pocketing all the money is all out in the open now.
Right.
I think it's being discussed and reported everywhere.
There was a report in Al Jazeera as well, which spoke about how $1.5 million was given to him in cash.
Correct. So I think all those things are now into the open. I think the people of Maldives, never underestimate the people of any country. If there is a proper democratic sort of election held, they will decide. They know they are living there.
So corruption.
And it's such a small country that everybody knows everything. I don't think there is any sort of anything hidden there, because it's such a small place. It's
right.
what, 4 lakhs? Maximum 4 lakhs people.
It's a tiny nation, island nation at the end of the day.
I think everybody is related to everybody. Even President Yamin is related. He's a half brother of President Gayoom, who's now, of course, happily been released from prison. But that's the kind of a place it is. It's a very small place. Everybody knows what's happening, and
small and a closely knit place at the end of the day.
Very closely knit place.
Right.
So
that's Bansal, yes.
See, 2 things. One is that because Maldives is very tiny and very small in terms of population, dispersed islands, it is extremely susceptible to international pressure. Having said that, let's be very clear, it's not a very decisive mandate. It's 58.3% against some 41 point some percent. So it's not that huge a margin, it's just 17% less. The victory has been attained primarily by disparate forces coming together. Gayoom, Qasim, MDP, that is Nasheed's party, all sorts of people have actually come together to form an alliance, because Yamin had trampled over every constitutional guarantee that was actually enshrined in this newly constituted constitution. If you look at it, he banned media, the main online newspapers were banned. When anybody reported against him, he struck against them. Virtually every big leader was either imprisoned or exiled. Nasheed was imprisoned, he had to go out for medical treatment, thereafter he didn't come. Gayoom was imprisoned. So he was getting after anybody. But at the same time, let me tell you, the decisive mandates do not matter. When people decide to stick to power, they decide to stick to power. Yamin may not be able to do so, because for that you actually need a brute military power. And I'll give you an example of 1999 Myanmar elections, when NLD had won far greater majority than what Yamin has actually conceded to Solih. If you look at that elections, it was a very, very decisive victory. But the military just refused to give power. So that election or decisive mandate doesn't matter. The only redeeming factor in this case is that Maldives is an archipelago island chain, a very tiny country with a very, very minuscule military force. So it's extremely susceptible to international pressure. Its economy is dependent on tourism, not like to do anything that actually derails it. But also remember, Maldives is the country with highest per capita participation in Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. It's an extremely radicalized society today. And that again is a cause for concern.
Right. Since you brought up several of the other people who have come together now in the Maldives, Professor, let's talk about Nasheed, really. He's tweeted saying that he's going to come back on November 1st. What kind of an impact is it going to have on the polity of Maldives also? Secondly, there are cases pending against him. What happens to that?
Sure. I think first thing I would underline that for me mandate is really decisive. 38,000 additional votes over 90,000 in a democracy, I think, is an enormous mandate for any leader to obtain. Especially as Bansal just mentioned, the kind of despotic control on military, on judiciary, on media, on bureaucracy, on even election commission that President Yamin had built over a period of time, which actually united, as he said, to everybody together to make sure that he's defeated. And so to me, that remains decisive. Enjoyed over a period of time. You now have Xi Jinping saying, we are willing to talk to the next leader and we are willing to engage with the next leader. So the strongest pillar of support, as if, is already drifting away from Yamin. European Union, United States, as I earlier mentioned, have really supported a free, fair election, and they want to make sure democratic transition takes place. India has been holding, as Ambassador says, strategic patience over a period of time. But I expect them to become, India to become, Prime Minister Modi has not visited Maldives. So this
He's
November...
been invited now.
So November 17 could be an occasion that you could have a high-profile presence of India to really showcase that we are an influence in what happens in the name of democracy, of course. So to me, it seems that transition may have hiccups, but I personally wouldn't look at that worst-case scenario of military intervention and being a possibility here, because majority of people inside and most nations outside are wanting to ensure transition takes place at this stage.
Ultimately, in the democracy, the people have spoken.
Yes.
And the people's will is what needs to be taken forward. Yeah, it should prevail.
I assume it will.
Okay. Ambassador, Professor brought up India. Many analysts, many experts believe that India should have intervened a few months ago itself, probably sent in the Navy when the Supreme Court issue was taking place. In hindsight, would you say that it was good that India did not intervene? And should we continue to meddle in the affairs of the Maldives going forward?
Well, I'm not going to answer that question yes or no, whether we should meddle in the affairs of our neighbors, etc. That is not a question that I can answer. There is always
spoken like a true diplomat.
No, there is always an element of engaging with different parties in any country, and a bit of influence that India can exert. It should exert, and it probably does. But what I'm trying to say is that what India should have done, you asked the question. I said the strategic patience that I have written about has probably played off, because I think India used other tools in its diplomatic tool to reach out to the people, to various other people. And I think the ground feedback was always there that this election might not go towards Yamin. So why do an intervention when you are more or less, you have convinced yourself through obviously a feedback from our mission and from other sources that we may have in that it's better to wait for the election to see how it goes. And since it is not going Yamin's way, so it's better to wait. So why intervene now and because intervention will again create an international situation. It will annoy all our neighbors, and it will again cast India in one of those, kind of a hegemonic kind of state in South Asia. So I think that was avoidable, and which we did, and I think that succeeded.
Right, Professor. Yeah, I'm coming to you.
Let me just say that the most important need for the new regime in Maldives will be who will replace China. China has been the most visible infrastructure building partner.
But can China be replaced really?
That's what I'm saying. What can be done to face that constant demand from the ground to have infrastructure built as they have seen over years, the last 5 years? So in this case, India has to not intervene militarily or otherwise, but for example, majorly developmental partnership will have to take several initiatives. First of all, provide developmental aid government to government. Encourage private industry in tourism industry, for example, in India to go and build things there. But more important, maybe help Maldives to obtain that developmental aid from international institutions. Maybe build some kind of a consortium. And mention was made of ISIS, elements are returning home and there's a problem inside Maldives. Again, India, look at our experience with Afghanistan. We can train their armed forces, paramilitary, even intelligence agencies to address with those issues. And finally, I think it's important to see that people on the ground who have spoken, and India has always been a country which is welcomed by the people in the street. And China, by comparison, is welcomed in the boardrooms where decisions are made. So engage people on the ground, do things which will lead to job creation, for example, to strengthen democracy in that sense. So I think there are many initiatives that are possible where India can influence. We are not trying to replace China immediately, but the things that Chinese have done over a period of time is something that people on the ground in Maldives will demand to continue to happen. What are the alternatives that can be provided is where India has to focus. All
right, India needs to focus on the alternatives going ahead is what the Professor is suggesting. Captain Bansal, you have a smile on your face. I can't really understand whether you're in agreement with what the Professor has said or in disagreement.
See, what I am saying is that now that everything has ended well, we could actually, with the benefit of hindsight, we can say that we took the wise decision. But please remember, last elections, what happened? The moment election went into the second phase, the tempering started. The Supreme Court annulled elections, kept annulling elections till a decisive mandate came in favor of Yameen. Correct. Such a thing could have happened this time also. And then we would have been in no position to do anything. What would have happened if the election would have gone into second round and Yameen would have won? We would not have had the moral authority to intervene at all. Whereas when the Supreme Court gave a judgment and he imposed an emergency, imprisoned 2 Supreme Court judges, it was a valid ground for international community to intervene. Like President Obama said when he had come during his last visit to Delhi, and when he says, when you want to become a great power, with great power status comes responsibilities. In our neighborhood, to maintain order is our responsibility. Should not call it meddling. That's actually shouldering the responsibility to ensure that just and democratic societies exist in our neighborhood. The second issue is the man in the streets used to like India. But with the radicalization growing up, that is also changing. Please remember, the radicalization in Maldives in last 2 decades has been phenomenal. In fact, it needs to be seen to be believed.
No, and it's a very grievous situation, really. The situation that you're mentioning. How do we remedy that?
So to my mind, of course, fortunately for us, now we have a government which has come. What we have to do is, Maldives needs institutional buildings. In fact, what happened was that you talked of Nasheed. Nasheed was too idealistic. In fact, his party MDP went in for inner party democracy, which is unprecedented in South Asia. They went in for elections at every level, and they decided the candidate who will contest the presidential election when Nasheed actually contested through that election process. An extremely democratic. But that sort of an idealism in a society like Maldives didn't work. And as Yameen showed it, when he came to power, he subverted every institution. So what Maldives needs today, firstly, is institutions, because their judiciary is actually dysfunctional. You need to establish a judiciary which functions. That independence of that judiciary has to be ensured. That we are already training their armed forces, but despite that, when the push come to shove, half the armed forces were divided. The people who were pro-MDP were sacked. So in a society like that, which is actually deeply divided, if you go back to the last elections, 2013, in fact, I always say, what was the margin? It was a minuscule margin. And first round he was leading. The Supreme Court effectively ensured that Yameen won by annulling elections. Election Commission was not allowed to function properly. So if a judiciary is partisan and is not independent and is not allowed to function the way it should function, then you have a problem because they didn't have judges.
Right.
So you have to establish institutions and then ensure that Maldives becomes an extremely democratic society. Another big problem in Maldives is, which you must understand, is when they went on to set up a constitution. It's a wonderful constitution, extremely democratic. But they could not address the issue of religion. The Maldives constitution says that every citizen has to be Sunni Muslim. Now, who decides who is a Sunni Muslim? Thereby, you actually allow theology to interfere into the constitution. That gives cleric a right to interfere into the constitution. That gives religion a locus standi. And as a result, we are seeing this radicalization.
Right.
So sooner or later, Maldives will have to address this issue of democracy with religion or democracy with secularism.
All right. Institution building is the way forward, is what Captain Bansal is suggesting. Ambassador Chakravarty, if you look at the the establishment that is to take over on the 17th of November, it's really a mix of many people who have come together. What's to say that these people will remain united in the years to come?
Well, very difficult to say whether they will remain united. But on the issue of institutions, I think it is somewhat of a cliche when we say we have to build institutions. Every democracy needs those institutions. But it doesn't happen in practice because you can see around the world, many people who come to power and then try to tinker with these institutions so as to remain in power, which is what Yameen has been doing really. So now what is the remedy? One remedy could be that regional countries get together or some major country wants them, intervenes, etc., to restore democracy. That is one way. But that is what we call, right to protect, but that's in the humanitarian aspect, but you can call it right to protect a democracy. But then is that the sort of legal way, or is that something that great powers tend to do or big powers tend to do in the interest of the region, the world, and themselves, I would say. So I would say that institution building is a must. But how the next man could again subvert the same institutions? Because you see, this is the problem. Unless you allow those institutions, if the political will is not there and you are so power hungry that you have to remain in power forever, then institution can never be built. So I think that is very important. The maturity of a democratic state or a democratic society is that you must allow these institutions to function independently.
Right. What role do you see India playing in shaping the future of Maldives, Professor?
I think India has been staying relatively mute, maybe partly because of the blockade that India had with Nepal. We learned lessons from there. So India decided to sort of keep safe distance in this case.
But could things change come
yes,
November 17th?
Yes. So I think now is an opportunity that India at least becomes part of the game, if not the most decisive player there. And we have to gradually inch in and then, showcase that we have strategic interests. And not just India, I think there's several other countries which are increasingly concerned. The way Chinese have kind of, there was mention of Myanmar and there was talk about Sinicization of Myanmar in early 1990s. That's what was happening in Maldives as well, and people are beginning to take note of that. So it's not just interest in what happens in Maldives in terms of democracy and institutions, but also in terms of what is China doing there. There's a particular island which they've already taken on lease for 50 years for mere $4 or $5 million, and about 3 dozen other islands where they are developing all kind of tourism industry. So it's an enormous presence that China today has in Maldives, and that concerns several other stakeholders who have interest in sea lanes of communication and freedom of navigation in Indian Ocean area. So I assume that there is much larger awareness and interest today in what happens in Maldives, where India can really play a certain influential role, as I said, in taking multivariate kind of initiatives and not looking as pushing things beyond what people want on the ground, but supportive role in doing things that people want to happen, democracy, development, and the security, for example. These are issues where India can showcase interest and initiative. And India must do that because that's our neighborhood, and Indian Ocean is then next door to us.
Right.
And we keep worried otherwise about what China is doing in the neighborhood. Here is a chance to rectify that.
Right. Talking about China, Alok, Bansal, close the show for us with your concluding remark about, whether countries around the world are realizing from within, the people themselves are realizing that the Chinese model is not something that is sustainable in the long run.
Undoubtedly. In fact, now we have clear-cut examples. You saw what happened in Malaysia. You see what's happening now in Zambia, where people are protesting against this. And this is going to happen in Maldives also. I'm sure the amount of what President Nasheed has been saying is actually the truth. An economy like Maldives cannot sustain that level of debt which actually China has actually given to Maldives. And I think Maldives will realistically have to move away from it. The redeeming factor is that the Chinese tourists to Maldives have increased phenomenally. In fact, if you go back about, say about 20 years back, there were hardly any Chinese tourists coming. But today, I think they are amongst the highest, I think third number as of now, the number of tourists who are coming to Maldives. And Maldives, as you know, is a high-end tourism destination. Bulk of them used to be earlier Europeans, and of late now Gulf states also have started contributing. So these are the things. I think, so Maldives will have to probably wind up some of these huge infrastructural projects which China wishes to take. As far as we are concerned, we have a problem. The Malé airport case is there. GMR was there, which we have to take into account. And one issue which you said, I think is a very, very relevant issue is that disparate groups have come together with the single point agenda of unseating Yamin. I do not think they will remain together. If Maldives history is any clue, or if these parties will break away. But fortunately, Maldives constitution gives precedent that's a fair amount of stability.
Right.
While the parliamentary elections you might see, which are actually going to happen, you might already see the parties fracturing away and breaking away and coming, contesting it separately. But what is most important, as I said, the institutions, when we are saying, the problem in Maldives was that the judges were not trained. They were all Sharia trained judges who were actually brought into the mainstream judiciary. Some of them had been trained in Egypt, Saudi Arabia, where. So I think the SARC or maybe India or some other countries have to provide trained judiciary.
Right.
So the judicial training is, I think, the key for stabilizing Maldives.
All right. On that note, then, we'll call it a wrap on this edition of India as well. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. We'd like to hear from you as well. Do share your feedback with us. Our email ID is indiasworld.feedback@gmail.com. You can also tweet to us using our Twitter handles at FRP09 and at Rajya Sabha TV. That's it from me. See you again next time.